In this section, we are going to look at how we get energy, metabolism, how we get energy to these skeletal muscles. And we're just looking at skeletal muscles right now, right? Again, like I said, we're going to introduce cardiac and smooth muscle here at the end, but we're looking at metabolism here for skeletal muscle. The vast majority of this chapter, like I said, again, is mostly skeletal muscle. So this looks at how skeletal muscles get that energy. And remember, it's ATP, right? Adenosine triphosphate. That is our energy source. Okay? That is our energy source. When we come to ATP, we don't really store a whole heck of a lot of it, minimal at best. It's just not something that we store. You could see here, muscles can store a little bit, about 5 seconds worth, if you really, kind of start and get after it. An intense exertion is very subjective. I get that. What is intense for me is not probably intense for you, and that's okay. All right. So that is going to be very, very subjective in that definition there. We have what's called myokinase. It can help to phosphorylate NADP. So skeletal muscle does have some enzymes, and that's what myokinase is, to help quickly add a phosphate to that ADP again to make ATP. So muscle can store a handful of seconds. It's not a whole lot, right? You burn through it really quick. And again, we can rapidly add a phosphate to ADP, phosphorylation, to give us more ATP relatively quickly. Again, if you don't have enough oxygen, that type of the ability of our skeletal muscles to depend on that, minimal at best. Okay. For us, we're going to be looking at 3 different ways that muscles, skeletal muscles, generally generate, in most cases, generate ATP. Creatine phosphate, and you may see it listed in some books as phosphocreatine. Same thing. Glycolysis, and the cellular respiration, aerobic cellular respiration. We could do we could put anaerobic there, but to be honest, you can't maintain high intensity effort with an anaerobic cellular respiration state. You only get like 2 ATP with that one, and that doesn't really work. You can only go for about maybe 2-3 minutes at an intense rate, and then the system, you won't be able to maintain that, and you'll be tired and you'll stop moving. So let's look at the big 3 here. Creatine phosphate. This is basically our first system that kicks in. All right. Again, I get it. We have myokinases, but I mean, not really huge. All right. Creatine phosphate is our first system. It gives us about 10 to 15 seconds of additional energy. So as soon as you get up from your chair and start to walk across the classroom to get out, this is going to be the system that kicks in. Okay. As you can kind of see there, high energy bond between creatine and phosphate, and it's creatine's ability to transfer that phosphate to ADP to get ATP that allows us to get that quick energy, 10 to 15 seconds worth, right? Really, in the grand scheme, creatine phosphate is great. You can see what's catalyzed by a specific enzyme, creatine kinase. But it helps us to get 10 to 15 seconds. It allows the other system, glycolysis, aerobic cellular respiration, to get ready to kick in, okay? Because 10 to 15 seconds, if you're going to be walking across campus, it's going to take you more than 10 to 15 seconds, right? So this system allows breathing to kick in, get more oxygen in, so you can make a heck of a lot more energy. Glycolysis, okay? Glycolysis does not require oxygen. All right, this happens out in the cytoplasm of the cell, and in that spot we are not in the presence of oxygen. Okay, glucose is going to be our primary drug of choice here. All right, we can get this from our muscles. Muscles can store sugar, glucose, as glycogen. Muscles can store Glucose is glycogen for long-term storage. How much is there kind of just depends on, how well trained the muscle is. You can also get glucose from the blood, from the liver. The liver also stores glycogen as well. Pulls it out of storage, clips off the glucose molecules, gets into the blood, gets into the cell, into the cytoplasm of that cell. We break down glucose and basically form in two pyruvate molecules. In the process, we also release 2 ATP. I guess I should say 2 net, right? Because there's 4 total. If you remember glycolysis, 4 total ATP, but we had to invest 2 molecules of ATP to break up glucose in the first few steps of glycolysis. So again, not a whole heck of a lot of energy. If we look at our stored little bit of a handful of seconds, then dovetail that to there, 15, 20 seconds, it's not a whole hell of a lot of energy. Even here in glycolysis, we haven't gotten a whole heck of a lot of energy either. So where is all this energy coming from? And I just said anaerobic ain't doing much either. Lactic acid metabolism, anaerobic metabolism, it only gets us 2 ATP as well. So where in the world is all this energy coming from? It's primarily coming from this one. This one does require oxygen. Hell, it's in its name. Aerobic means air. What's in the air that we use? Oxygen. When we say aerobic cellular respiration and we connect that dot of oxygen, we also need to connect the dot of mitochondria, because aerobic cellular respiration occurs within the mitochondria. You remember the whole metabolism pathway. We have glycolysis, we have a transition reaction, we have Krebs cycle, and we have the electron transport chain. The transition reaction, the Krebs cycle, the electron transport chain, all of that happens in the mitochondria. So I need oxygen present, okay? And yes, I'm sitting down, I have oxygen present. I get it, okay? I need to bring in more oxygen, okay? So as soon as you start to put forth more activity, you're going to start breathing more, okay? You're going to have different receptors that will be detecting levels of carbon dioxide in the blood, which increases when you increase muscular demand, okay? So if I have an increase in carbon dioxide in the blood, I have receptors for that. It's going to say, okay, brain, you need to tell the lungs to start, inflating faster, heart to start beating faster to get that oxygen in and to get that oxygen-rich blood distributed. This aerobic cellular respiration, which again occurs only in the mitochondria, allows us to produce anywhere between 30, 32 ATP. So this is where the vast majority of our energy is coming from. And this is just from glucose. If we were looking at the utilization of fats to supply energy for skeletal muscles, then you're looking at a typical fat, typical fatty acid providing upwards of 108-ish ATP units, okay? So, proteins can be involved in this process as well. Not ideal. And dependent upon the protein, depends upon the exact yield. And so there's a lot of mental gymnastics there. But when it comes to supplying energy for muscles, we primarily look at glucose because that's its primary function, okay? And here's a nice little, excuse me, a nice little kind of synopsis here. Again, creatine kinase helps us to phosphorylate creatine and a phosphate molecule onto ATP. Carnitine works in that fashion as well. Actually, carnitine helps with facilitating fatty acid chains from the cytoplasm into the mitochondria. So that's why L-carnitine is usually, said to be helpful, somewhat effective in terms of mobilizing your fat stores for use to make energy. But you can see, you know, a little bit of present in the muscle there, myosin kinase, creatine kinase, phosphocreatine system, all right, helping to give us some initial oomphs of energy, all right? Then we dive into glycolysis. Glycolysis, again, happening out in the cytoplasm of the cell, gives us net of 2 ATP and 2 pyruvate molecules. We also get the production of what's called NADH, and it's important because that will go into the electron transport chain and help with that bigger yield of energy that happens with aerobic cellular respiration, which again happens only in the mitochondria. And for there we have, as you can kind of see there, there's my citric acid cycle, and there's my electron transport chain. And it's these two things, along with the transition reaction, but it's these two major systems here, cycles, that help to generate that 30 to 32 ATP that we typically see coming from glucose molecules itself. Again, if this was fatty acid chains from triglyceride, it'll give us around 108 ATP. All right. So our fuel source does yield us different variant types of ATP. The longer the fatty acid chain, the more ATP. The shorter, the lesser. But in rough retrospect, it's roughly around 108 ATP. What if we get into a spot where I don't have as much oxygen readily available? Okay, and anaerobic means without, you know, in the absence of oxygen. You always have oxygen present unless, you know, it's being cut off from your body, or you know you're in a chamber and someone's sucking out the air, right? You're always in the presence of oxygen. You're just not getting enough to maintain that physical output of energy. When you get into that kind of state, here is what happens. This is anaerobic, okay? You get lactic acid formation. This is anaerobic, A-N-A-E-R, that's an A, A-E-R-O-B-I-C, okay? This is anaerobic. What happens? Glucose enters into glycolysis. We break it down, okay? We get 2 ATP, and we get some molecules of NADH, like I said, and we get our 2 pyruvate molecules. Well, if there's not enough oxygen present, I can't get into the door of the mitochondria. So that pyruvate starts to kind of accumulate. Cell don't like. So actually it will convert, it'll take those NADHs, take those electrons and convert pyruvate to what's called lactate or lactic acid, however you want to view it, it's the same thing. And you can see it's done by a specific enzyme there, lactate dehydrogenase. The cell, skeletal muscle, cannot use it. We have to pump it out. That takes energy. Gets into the blood, we send it to the liver. There in the liver, we actually take up that lactic acid and convert it back to glucose. This is referred to as the Cori cycle. All right, down here at the bottom, Cori cycle, C-O-R-Y, C-Y-C-L-E. So the Cori cycle is the process that occurs only in the liver, where it takes that lactate and recycles it back into glucose. Glucose gets back into the blood, back into the cell, and we can use it again. Again, this type of mechanism is only really designed to go about 2 or 3 minutes at high intensity. That's when you would see this lactic acid, this anaerobic metabolism kick in. Lactic acid is fantastic. It's been the boogeyman for many, 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 many decades. Over the last handful of years or so, it's actually been shown to help really allow muscles to be better effective at utilizing oxygen. Okay? They're finding that yes, it is an acid. It does change the pH, but it's not so negative in that regard. Those that get into this lactic acid state, the muscles have to work harder to effectively pump it out, recycle it there, send it to the liver to recycle it and use it. That actually makes the muscles more adept at utilizing oxygen, utilizing that lactic acid, recycling it. And in long-term studies, they're finding out now that it actually helps with getting the muscles to be much more aerobic in the grand scheme of things. So, here's a visual. And if this helps you, fantastic. Okay. Energy supply and varying intensity. I mean, a 50-meter sprint, less than 10 seconds. I mean, we're primarily using our phosphate transfer. 5 seconds, creatine phosphate system, bada boom, bada bing. Very quick, but not a whole heck of a lot of distance and a lot of time. For a 400-meter sprint, less than a minute, you can see we're going to go through our phosphocreatine system or creatine kinase system. We're going to do our stored ATP. But you can kind of see we're getting to glycolysis. And there we stop. For anything of great distance, okay, greater than 400 meters, more than a minute, we are going to get aerobic processes. Okay. Now, this is a run. This is not a sprint. Okay. So you're not going high intensity. Okay. Low to moderate intensity. And again, it's very subjective. All right. But you can see I'm getting enough oxygen in, as you can kind of see there, primarily by aerobic processes. Okay. So after that first minute, blowing through my stores, phosphocreatine, creatine kinase, glycolysis, you can see I get to the aerobic processes. Okay. And as long as I have enough oxygen coming in, I can maintain that. So that's at a very low to moderate, type of intensity, probably more moderate, to be honest. If you went really low intensity, you are usually going to use more fat stores. So if that's something you're looking to try to, if that's something you're trying to get rid of, more low intensity stuff, longer duration, you can burn more fat stores. We have this concept called oxygen debt. And when you get to that point where you can't exercise anymore, or you can't do that same activity level anymore at that perfect good level, you get into a spot where you can't get enough oxygen into the muscles to help pump out the lactic acid, send it back to the liver to recycle, bring it back. There's a lot of things going on. Okay? And we'll talk about some of those when we start looking at the cardiovascular system. But oxygen debt is the debt that we have to repay to get back to our pre-exercise level. What does that mean? Well, we need to replace oxygen on hemoglobin and myoglobin. Okay, hemoglobin is what holds onto oxygen in a red blood cell. I'll put red blood cell, RBC. That's a B. B. Okay, and myoglobin holds onto that in muscle. Oxygen. We have to replenish our glycogen stores. Whether you do some kind of drink with some carbs in them, or you eat something carby, the more simpler, the faster it gets in to replenish that glycogen levels. As you sit there, and return back to a normal breathing pattern, you're going to help replenish your ATP stores, a handful of seconds, and you'll replenish your creatine phosphate, which helps us to get that quick ATP. And lastly, to convert all of that lactic acid that you've produced back into glucose. Now, once you get control of your breathing, does that mean you've done all this? No. How fast does this get? It depends on your level of fitness. Okay. Those that are more fit, they can do all this stuff and get back to normal a heck of a lot quicker than somebody who is not as physically fit. And that depends also on your training method. Okay, somebody who trains for long distance running, marathons, they're going to be able to probably get back a lot faster than somebody who does explosive movements. Okay. The person who does explosive movements may not be able to get all this back in a very short period of time to do that same movement again. Okay, so all of this takes time, but this is the concept of oxygen debt.